how to be open, because when you are writing and when you are directing, I feel at the same time you have to be very confident in the decisions you are making, because the whole crew and the cast rely on your leadership. But at the same time you have to be very humble and accept that just because you're the director, maybe your idea is not as good. And that's a very interesting balance, to be able to recognize and acknowledge when someone presents something better and you say, okay, you know what? Forget what I was saying. Let's do it your way. But I also think it's important to just keep in mind and try to study a little bit the structure of the scripts and the movies, because that for me is a very big guideline to understand if what we are trying to say, if what we are trying to achieve is this, how are all these little elements serving that purpose or maybe not serving it. So I think you need a very big clarity to understand what story you're telling, what are you trying to say with that story. And I think that comes a lot from the dialogue in this case with Anthony. But then understanding that not everything that happened in his life is going to serve that story, uh, and understanding that there is a saying that I used to hear all the time in film sets and when I went to film school: less is more. Sometimes you achieve a stronger result if you are focused on one thing that hits the audience really hard, as opposed to trying to throw too many elements, too many characters, too many situations that are just going to distract from that main goal.
Funny enough, I actually saw another one of your films at a festival, Parousia, which it's honestly kind of crazy because I was there to see another film that I had worked on, and then this film played that we were all like, "Oh my gosh, this is amazing! Who did this?" Because we were gonna like look them up, and then it was like Miguel, and we were like, "Oh my gosh, it's you!" So I was just wondering if you wanted to maybe talk about that film a little bit.
Um, you're making me flush. Thank you. That's
I'm just being honest.
yes. So actually, by contrast with what we have been talking so far, that film is my baby of something that I wrote. It's not anybody's else. It's not anybody else's idea. I've been toying with that for a long time, and I really try to go all out with the fact that before I got into film, I studied philosophy. And I was really fascinated by a lot of the things in philosophy. And one of my goals is still to try to make films based on some of those ideas that I find so fascinating. And sometimes I feel people are not super aware of some of those ideas. So I'm always thinking, how can I introduce something else in the films? Uh, and the short that you are mentioning, even from the title, is very much making a statement. The film is called Parousia, which is a Greek word, which is used to indicate the second coming of Jesus in the Bible, and also a little bit, it means to arrive. But in the Bible specifically, it's used in some version in Greek, to indicate the second coming of Jesus. So I've always been fascinated with a lot of those ideas and stories. I grew up as a Catholic. I am from Colombia, which is a very Catholic country. I went to a Catholic high school, and I've always been fascinated with the idea of Jesus, the tension that some people see Jesus as a god, and some people see Jesus as a guy who are like really good, but that tension between the divine and the human. So all of that, I was like, I need to write something regarding that, and with a couple of very strong influences, which are random, but uh, Kevin Smith made a movie called Dogma in the early 2000s
Yes,
with
he
Ben
did.
Affleck, Ben Affleck, Matt Damon,
Yep, I
Alan
remember
Rickman.
sneaking to watch that on Comedy Central, which was a station I was not supposed to be watching.
uh, and that movie really inspired me when I first saw it. It's a comedy, and I was trying to do a drama with my film, but a little bit inspired in that movie. The question is, well, imagine if you have a child, a 10-year-old, 11-year-old, and you go and you tell them, guess what? You are the son of God, and you have the responsibility of the whole world in your shoulders. Like, that's freaky. Like, the first reaction to that would be like, I'm afraid, I don't want this. I was very inspired by that, but I didn't want to try to go and revisit the story of Jesus in the past. So, with all this idea of the second coming, I was wondering, well, what if Jesus came back today? What would that look like? And how this new Jesus react to all of that? So, all of that inspired me to make that film. Is is 7 minutes long, which is like how with all those grand themes. But the film basically is following this girl who's 9 years old, and she is the second coming of Jesus. Which again, I'm like, well, if Jesus is gonna come back today for representation, I don't think Jesus would pick a guy again.
No, I love that concept of like maybe it's just going to be a little girl. Maybe it's just an 8-year-old girl.
Yeah, and again, it like, why, like, why does Jesus has to be a guy? And I had people that watch the show and they are like, well, but Jesus is a guy. But I'm like, well, he was a guy 2000 years ago, but if it's born again, it could be a girl. Like, a girl could also be the daughter of God. Why not?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I mean, even kind of this might be something that I cut out, but I mean, people also generally depict Jesus as a white male, which was absolutely not. That's a real miracle if that was the case, is all I'm saying.
Exactly. So I think what you're saying is great because that's a lot of my intent. My intent is to disrupt a little bit with some ideas that, oh, Jesus is a guy and he's white, but it like, well, first of all, probably not, but second of all, like, you need to dig deeper about message, like, what's the purpose of Jesus, like, let's talk about that. But then in my idea to humanize Jesus and to show that it's not like this all-knowing person that has all the answers. So in my story, it's a little girl, and she meets a priest, a former priest, that discovers that she has these powers, these abilities that make her the second coming. But then the whole film is like she's asking him to not say anything because she's afraid, she's not ready to assume that. And
Hmm.
at the end of the film, he agrees. He's like, okay, I'm gonna keep your secret. Um, and again, for me, this idea of let's not forget about the human part. Let's not forget about the fear. Let's not forget about all of those emotions, even when we are dealing with like a large figure like Jesus. So that's where that came from.
That's amazing.
I was doing some reading online about you, and I actually found this really interesting quote.
Yeah, we've both been
Um,
creeping on you, just so you know. That's how we
yeah.
roll this.
Okay.
I love doing my research. I love research and data. And one of the things I found was it says, in his work, the questions are more important than the answers. And is that something that you agree with? Is that something that you aim to do with the work that you're doing?
Um, wow, you make me feel like I'm famous. Thank you so much.
We're very interested in you.
I thank you for bringing that quote up. I think that is a very powerful quote, and I do think that's true for my work. It's always something that I try to do because it's also part of my training. Before I got into film, I mentioned I studied philosophy, and philosophy is very good at not giving any answers. And I've been training that with the idea that sometimes the most important thing is not to give an answer, but to know how to ask the question. And I just think that is a little powerful in a lot of ways. From a film perspective, is simply the idea that I want people to walk out of my movie wondering something, right? And sometimes it could be very personal. It could be like, wow, maybe how is my relationship with my dad? But hopefully, it can also be something more general, like with parousia. What I want people to question is like, oh, okay, so how would I treat Jesus if I have met Jesus? Like, and it goes through the thing that maybe we don't have the ability to recognize what Jesus would look like today. Uh, And finally, at a deeper level, I also think that, let's say today, I don't know if you've seen the news, but like, there's like a lot of wacky things happening in the country.
Trying to not see the news, to be honest.
Like in the last 6 months. But my point about that is that I think we should be very aware that one of the bases of democracy is the fact that we should be able to engage in the public sphere in a conversation. Um, and I think the problem that we're seeing today is that people are not asking questions. People already have all the answers.
I think that I mean, I don't want to say that we just solved the nation's problem on our podcast, but I think if more people listen to you, we might have less problems because that's I think that you're exactly right. And I never really thought about it that way.
Yeah, exactly, exactly, and it goes back to the idea of like if you're a director, but also if you're a citizen, you have to be very humble to like listen and ask questions and be like, wait, I don't understand this. Can you explain? Or like this doesn't make sense to me. And that doesn't mean you don't have a spine. It doesn't mean you don't have beliefs. Like you do have your beliefs, but when you go into a public sphere, it should be like a safe environment where you can talk. And I feel that doesn't, the conditions are not given for that. And again, it's like the question is more important than the answer. We should always be asking the question, and it applies to films, but it also applies to politics or to whatever you want. The moment you're setting an answer is the moment that you stop learning, that you stop growing.
I love that. That's really, really beautiful. I'm sorry. I'm like,
Thank you.
I feel like I'm a little bit speechless. I feel like that might be one of the most open and honest and truthful things that I've heard in 2020. So that was really, really great. Janelle, do you have any questions or anything? Or
No, I mean, I fully agree with you that like the whole as a whole we need to be like asking more questions. So I'm curious because you kind of mentioned a little bit what those questions would be with some of the films and things like that, but is there any like overall question that you're trying? Like, are you, with the work that you're creating now, or do you feel like there's a focus on a certain question or that you're trying to explore and maybe find out for yourself? I mean, there doesn't have to be an answer to that. I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is a very good question. Honestly, I think I'll have to look back and try to analyze it. Consciously, I haven't had like a one main question that I try to focus the movies, not particularly. Um, but I think it's very interesting. Like I hadn't really thought about it, and I would love to go back and see what are the recurring themes because that's also something that happens. Like with art, when you start creating, there's